picture. They throw it in every few years. And so what I want us to look at, like we did with Columbus, 3 things that catch your attention to that question. Questions of curiosity, essentially, and 1 conclusion you can make from this, 1 inference from this. So I'll give you all about 40 seconds to look at this. All right, Layla, what's something that catches your attention?
How there's the redcoats that are obviously the British, like shrouded in smoke and then got into the crowd.
Very good, Aiden.
There's a lot of blood.
A lot of blood, yeah, as you can see there. Inu.
Wait, what was the question?
3 things that catch your attention about this picture.
Like, there are a lot of dead people.
Yes, there are a lot of dead people. Who are they getting shot by? The redcoats. Very good. Ellie, what's something that kind of questions your curiosity?
I wonder if like the big crowd of people had anything to defend themselves with, or if it's just the police, the weapons.
Very good. Very good question. Terry?
I don't know, it's a commander, suppose. Doesn't look like he's giving the order to fire.
He looks like he's kind of giving an order to fire, you said?
He kind of looks like he's not giving the order.
Yeah, maybe trying to tell him to stop, maybe, or because typically when they do fire, they lower it. One other thing that somebody pointed out, which I've seen this picture many times and broken it down, but something that we even spent one whole 10 minutes talking about that dog in college. Like, why is that dog there? But something that was pointed out. Look at this, the difference in kind of the weather almost, which is weird, because and it makes you think, who do you think likely drew this picture? Drew colonists or a British person? Colonists. I mean, you look at all this smoke coming up in the air, look at all the blood, and you see doom and gloom weather over here. Kind of sun, moon, I don't know what the heck that's supposed to be. If it's sunny, because this was in the kind of the evening time, late evening time. Let's see. Yvonne, what's 1 conclusion you can make from this?
The redcoats are trying to make a point by shooting all the colonists.
Very good. Anybody else want to toss in something unique? Yes, sir?
I had a question.
Yes, sir.
I asked if the painting's accurate to what actually happened.
Yeah,
How much
because it was a colonist who painted it, there's a bit of bias. There were only 5 people killed, a few others shot, and I feel like it was a little over exaggerated. The crowd was a little bit bigger. It initially was only one guy one colonist who kind of sparked everything, and was just kind of toying with 1 redcoat, and he kind of brought up of a group. I think if anything's over exaggerated, it's the amount of colonists that were killed or shot, essentially, and the amount of gunpowder, smoke up in the air. So, that clear that up? So now I'm going to show a quick video about the Boston Massacre. Gives a little more in-depth analysis about it and talks about it. Not really any.
The Boston Massacre. Everything you need to know. On the same day that Parliament repealed most of the Townshend Acts, a bloody riot exploded in Boston. The arrival of British troops had caused tensions to rise, and the relationship between Bostonians and Redcoats, as the British soldiers were called, had deteriorated so badly that one spark sent the city into chaos. What was that spark? British soldiers in Boston, the most rebellious city in the American colonies, had certainly been an unwelcome sight. Soldiers and civilians cursed each other in the streets, and clashes were consistent and often violent. British soldiers, finding themselves in a hostile environment, began viewing Bostonians as even more rebellious than the Irish. They called Bostonians Yankees as an insult. A harsh fact that British soldiers experienced was meager pay. Faced with such a poor salary and boredom, many sought to take on a second job. Male Bostonians resented the fact that 600 soldiers stationed in the city were competing with them for labor and the attention of the ladies. On March the 5th, 1770, a lone British soldier stood guard outside the customs house. It was a cold evening, and he gazed out at the filthy piles of snow and ice, patiently awaiting the end of his shift. A young colonist exited a tavern, and he and the soldier exchanged insults. The drunken colonial approached the soldier and poked him in the chest. The soldier retaliated by clubbing the man with the butt of his musket. As the colonist fell to the ground, he shouted. Taverns emptied as colonists, many of them drunk, gathered around the lone guard. 6 more British soldiers rallied to provide support, and the 7 men found themselves surrounded by an angry mob that soon numbered in the hundreds. Someone began ringing a church bell, adding more noise and attention to the mayhem. The colonists began pelting the soldiers with chunks of ice and snowballs. Crispus Attucks, a mulatto of Native American and African descent, walked right up to within inches of a soldier's bayonet and dared him to fire. A British officer ordered the town magistrate to read the riot act, but he refused out of fear for his life. Someone in the crowd struck a soldier with a club, sending him to the snowy ground. The man sprang to his feet and was struck a second time. He raised his musket and pulled the trigger. The other soldiers took it as a signal and fired into the crowd. A great screech came from the mob as bullets cut their way through. Crispus Attucks and 4 other Bostonians fell dead, while 6 more were wounded. The mob fled in all directions. For several hours, the city teetered on the brink of a bloodbath. Citizens were outraged, and Boston's Sons of Liberty, who were all armed, outnumbered the Redcoats 5-1. The colonists' rage subsided only after Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson promised to try the soldiers for murder. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere created an elaborate print titled The Bloody Massacre, perpetuated in King Street, and the Sons of Liberty used as a powerful piece of propaganda. British troops were withdrawn from the city, and those involved were put on trial for murder. Sam Adams was the driving force behind the trial, and, in an odd coincidence, his cousin John Adams defended the 7 soldiers. John Adams argued that emotions cannot override facts, and that the soldiers had acted in self-defense. They were found not guilty, but 2 had their thumbs branded for killing people in the crowd by accident. All of the soldiers had to leave the American colonies for their own protection.
Alright, so that's a little bit more about the Boston Massacre. And the Boston Massacre is kind of a, prelude to the Boston Tea Party, but really what kind of sparked the Boston Massacre was the presence of British soldiers in the city. It was many Bostonians resented the presence of British troops in their city, and all throughout the colonies, there was protests going on, but we see the center of, this rambunctious protest is Boston. Boston is where everybody is behind this, the boycotts of goods from England and Britain, and behind, protesting, and they do not like the presence of British troops in their city. And so on a cold, snowy day in March of 1770, a crowd of drunken colonists outside of the tavern harassed these guards. And one thing led to another, and 5 colonists were killed by these soldiers. And at the trial, the soldiers were acquitted of the murders. And the impact of this Boston Massacre was, we talked about kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back, and this is getting there. The colonists are fed up with these continued acts, restricting their freedoms. The British are fed up with the response from the colonists to these acts, and blood is boiling. Blood has now been shed, and we're right on the verge of a war, essentially, between the colonists and the redcoats. Now, Samuel Adams and a few other Americans kept alive the view that British officials were undermining colonial liberties. Thought it was interesting, John Adams defended the colonists, whereas